Hi everyone, we're back. Now we're going to be talking about transitioning from blocks to text in MakeCode Arcade. If you just joined us, my name is Sarah and I'm joined by Bill. And we work for Code Ninjas on the education team. And we're responsible for creating the content for just all the students in our franchise locations across 3 countries. So we've got quite a big population. And we've used MakeCode Arcade to develop our core curriculum. And one of the reasons that we chose to use MakeCode is because of its feature of how it so seamlessly converts code in blocks, and you can transfer that code into JavaScript text. And also during our writing process, we, worked with several team members, and many of us came from more of an education background rather than a computer science background. And so we didn't already have this JavaScript background at all. And so as we were writing the curriculum, a lot of us were going through the same process that many of your students might be going through of we've kind of dabbled coding in blocks, coding a variety of projects, building that foundation through blocks, and then figuring out how to transfer that knowledge into text. We're going to be primarily talking about JavaScript today, but as many of you know, you can also transfer code into Python. But we just wanted to share that to kind of give some context of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to pass it back to Bill, if you want to go to the next slide.
Great, thanks, Sara. So MakeCode Arcade provides a smooth and beginner-friendly pathway for transitioning from block-based coding to text-based coding. Oops. There we go. And so it's really cool that it offers both JavaScript and Python. There's great reasons for using both of those different languages. At Code Ninjas, we do prefer to use JavaScript. That's just what a lot of our curriculum has been written in the past, but it's awesome that kids have that option. And that flexibility makes it an excellent tool for scaffolding students' understanding. So yeah, starting with the visual blocks, help kids grasp those foundational computer science concepts, and then moving on to the more advanced syntax of text-based code once they already understand those computer science concepts. That switch between blocks and text views and the MakeCode Arcade editor, to do so, you want to begin by creating a project in blocks, and you can see that on the left side of the screen. And then along the top of the editor, you can actually select JavaScript and then click on that arrow to see the dropdown, and that's where you can also select from Python. And then the project will just automatically convert your code. It's really cool to see that happen. And today what we're going to talk about are some of those nuances and interesting things that occur when you do transition a project from blocks to text and then back. So Sarah and I are going to talk about that. On the next slide, we're actually going to share a link with you so you can follow along with us. We're not going to be doing any live coding today. We have lots of screenshots and things, but you can do some live coding by grabbing the link on this on the top of this slide, and even do what I just said, which Sarah's about to walk you through too as well.
Yeah. Awesome, Bill. So like Bill said, the example project, if you want to tinker or just look through some of the example code with us, is at the top of the slide. It's aka.ms/arcadecon-blocks to text. We'll be walking through those examples, and all of those code blocks are present in the project. But to get started, we just wanted you to kind of take a second and start to identify some similarities, some differences, some nuances that Bill just mentioned between the code in blocks versus the code in JavaScript. So on the left side of the screen, again, you'll see that code in blocks. It's the same exact code on the JavaScript side, but just take a second and share some ideas in the chat. What are some similarities that you notice? What are some differences? And what do you wonder about these two views? So take a second, and we'd love to hear just some of your initial thoughts, just looking at these two images just kind of side by side in this project. We're both former teachers and very good at wait time, but we do, want to make sure we have enough time to get through everything, but no worries. Oh, awesome. Yeah. So Mine Art Book says simplify and complex. Sprites are objects, says Dawn. Yeah, the left side, right. is very visual. The blocks are easy to understand. The text is a bit more complex. Don said sprites are objects on the JavaScript side. Awesome. All right. Well, if others have more ideas, feel free to continue popping those in the chat. Matthew says, I always find it interesting that the order in JavaScript doesn't usually match the blocks. Absolutely. We're going to talk more about that as well. Daksha says blocks are easy on the eyes. For sure. You can really see how much easier it is, especially for young kids, to get started with the visual display of the blocks before they even get into, reading this complex text, especially if we're thinking about maybe upper elementary students. You can see how much easier the blocks are as they're, still they've learned to read, but, are not maybe proficient readers yet. And then once they're ready, they're able to kind of graduate, I think someone said earlier, into the more advanced text-based code. Alrighty, thank you everyone for sharing. I'm going to pass it back to Bill.
Awesome. So we are going to jump right in by taking a look at a single function, and a pretty common function that kids might use in both blocks and JavaScript in their projects. So in blocks, students are introduced to a variety of functions, including this set background color block. They can customize those functions using parameters that have visual graphic tools, such as this drop-down menu to visually select a color that assigns the background color. MakeCode Arcade offers those 16 color choices, and each color choice is actually assigned in each color is assigned a unique color in the paint editor. When customizing the background color in JavaScript, users will still have to add a color parameter, but instead of just selecting the color from that dropdown, they actually have to select a number. So already we're seeing that it's really easy for kids to get started in blocks and takes a little bit more practice to get started in JavaScript. So it's really helpful if they are already familiar with that idea of dragging in the block, clicking on that gray bubble and seeing that color palette pop up. It then makes it easier when you explain like, okay, well now you just have to think of the numbers for each of those colors and input that as a parameter.
Yeah. So this transition from blocks into JavaScript also gives students access to a wider range of functions and parameters for their projects. So for example, in these screenshots, we have the sprite say block, which makes sprite say a message on screen. In the blocks editor, it has just 3 parameters. You can specify the message that's going to be shared, how long it appears on screen, and whether or not the text is animated. So if it appears one letter at a time on screen. When you go to the JavaScript editor, and as students add those parameters within the parentheses, a pop-up guide that's shown at the bottom of the slide will appear. We call that the code completion tool, and it will reveal additional options. So not only do you have those 3 parameters, but you also have the option to set the text color and the text box color. And it just gives students a greater creative control and flexibility in their code. And they can see, we got started in blocks, we had a few options. Now that we're in JavaScript, we have even more options. And not only is it just these parameters, but they're actually additional functions that are only available in JavaScript. At Code Ninjas, we endearingly call them secret menu options that are only accessible if you, type the dot operator, and can find them within that pop-up window as well. On the flip side, if you want to go to the next slide, Bill. So if you're going, one great feature of the MakeCode Arcade editor is that not only can you convert code from blocks into JavaScript, but you can go both directions. You can convert code that's already in JavaScript back into blocks. But because of this, if you've used a function or a parameter that's only available in blocks, what does it look like, that's only available in JavaScript, what does it look like when you flip back to blocks? And so at the bottom of the screenshot, you can see that gray block. Notice how the JavaScript text is preserved. It doesn't have the drop-down menus that are usually available in blocks. And so it's not editable in this form. You'd have to go back to the JavaScript editor to edit and change any of those parameters. If you deleted the text color and the text box color and then converted it back to blocks, it would resume the normal functionality. But this is just, again, one of those nuances that students will encounter, especially if they're in this transition and kind of toggling back and forth between blocks and JavaScript and testing out new functions and parameters. They might notice some of these gray blocks appear. The project will run totally normally. They'll just need to go back to the JavaScript editor to make any other changes.
And before I leave this slide, I want to point out that we still have that link for the starter code project that's along the top there. And that's the same link. We're just using one project. And you can actually try these things out for yourself if you haven't already experienced them. All of the code that you need is exploded, as we like to say. It means like the blocks are just out in the editor area, but they're not actually plugged into an onStart loop or one of the other containers. But yeah, try this out. We highly recommend. Put that say text block into the onStart, toggle to JavaScript, play with some of those advanced parameters that are only available in the JavaScript, and flip back to see this for yourself. Because again, we're not doing the live coding here, but please do follow along and experience that, and then share what you find in the chat as well. So yeah, the next thing that I want to talk about was the idea of events and what these container blocks look like in JavaScript. So what's really cool about blocks is that you have this container or C block, which visually shows that the code blocks inside of the container will run when that event occurs. As students transition to text, it's really important to point out where that container exists, and you can see that highlighted in yellow on the code part of the screen up ahead. And that helps students notice that those curly brackets really are making that container shape, and that all functions are put inside those curly brackets in the same way that all of those blocks were dragged inside that container. Like the set background color function we chatted about earlier, this button pressed event also has customizable parameters too. And so it's important to point out that in this connection between blocks and text, that in blocks, students can use those drop-down menus to select the button and the type of event parameters. But in JavaScript, those parameters are still there. They must just be retyped in order to change that argument. This is also a really great time to use that code completion tool, which will help students sort of autofill that. So typing like controller button event and something's going to pop up, especially after they type the dot operator, that will show them some of those options that are available. So students aren't fully left on their own, but it does help to have some of that prior knowledge from coding in blocks to know what those parameters might be. So once we introduce additional container blocks into our code in blocks, looking over at JavaScript, we realize that when we flip back and forth, that things might appear in a different order. So as you can see in the top part of this slide, we have that onStart loop or the onStart container first, and then the onA button press container second. But when we flip to JavaScript, events are usually placed above any code that was put in the onStart container. And there is a certain sequence that the code follows that's just built into the tool. And so it's important to prepare students to anticipate that their code will appear in a different order. So yeah, as you can see here, the onA button pressed is underneath the onStart, but in that code snippet, the A button pressed event is showing up in lines 1, 2, and 3. So it's important that kids are aware of that. They're welcome to copy paste it and move it down to a place where they'd prefer to have it. But yeah, this is just part of the JavaScript editor. It's also important to notice that kids will not see the onStart container. That will not exist. The code that's in the onStart will just appear written out, typically, again, below different events.
Yeah. And so like all these examples that we've mentioned, but starting in the blocks editor just really helps students kind of grasp these complex computer science concepts, especially in a more approachable way. For example, if we're looking at the repeat loop as shown on the slide, in blocks, it looks really simple. You have that simple container block. You have one parameter that sets how many times the loop runs. You can drag those blocks into the loop. And yeah, you can easily just change how frequently the loop runs. When you switch to the JavaScript editor, you can see how much more advanced it becomes. The repeat loops are translated into for loops, and they have three expressions. One to initialize the variable, one to set the loop condition, and one to update the variable. And you can just see just how much more of a text load that is for students to read through. And so at first, the syntax might feel pretty overwhelming. And so just having that solid understanding of repeat loops in blocks provides that helpful foundation, especially if you're introducing what this looks like in JavaScript. It's helpful to go back to blocks and saying, when we were in blocks, here's what the repeat loop looked like. What do you notice as we go into JavaScript? Where do you notice if we set the loop to repeat 4 times, where does that appear in the for loop? And so as students become more comfortable, for loops in JavaScript also allow for more flexibility. So now that we know what it looks like in both contexts, instead of just using numbers, students can also use Booleans or variables and other conditions, and just expand the way that these loops and events can be controlled and customized. So we think it's all about just kind of easing this transition, again, showing those similarities, those differences, showing the connections and how, the same code can be run in blocks versus JavaScript, but then also expanding and saying, wow, like when we're working in JavaScript, it really just opens up new opportunities for us to personalize and continue customizing the code in a project.
Same is also very true of using arrays and array functions. In fact, again, encourage you to open up that starter project. This code that you see on screen here is already in the coding area, and you can just remove the other code from the onStart and drag this code in, and even encourage you to try out some of the other array functions because this is really a key feature of this switch between blocks and text, because the blocks editor makes it easy for students to explore arrays and their functions, because each array block clearly describes the action. For example, it says, add this value to the end of this array, or remove the first value from this list. Unfortunately, that is not the same for the actual array functions in JavaScript, because when you switch to JavaScript, those actions are represented by function names like push and shift, which over time students will begin to understand, but initially those names are not intuitive. And so it can be really helpful for students to be able to switch back and forth to the blocks editor to remind themselves about what each of those array functions actually does in more plain language. That back and forth reinforces understanding while giving students a bridge between visual and text-based coding. Again, highly recommend, if you have not already played with that, to drag in just a bunch of those array functions, switch to JavaScript, see what they're named. Also, Sarah mentioned earlier, we refer to them as the secret menu options. There's a lot of additional array functions available in the code completion tool that you can find in Access that you might not be able to find in blocks. So it's also good to explore that and notice what is possible. Yeah, arrays especially are something that's can be complex for students to understand, especially if they're a little bit younger. And so having that transition between blocks and JavaScript just makes it that much easier and that much more accessible.
Before we go on to this last example, I saw a comment from Geldrick. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They say blocks means the students will never experience a syntax error. And Don says, if you try hard enough, you can have syntax errors. But I totally agree. They will not have the typical syntax error where they, don't add a space in some place or forget to add a semicolon. But syntax still matters. We still talk about sequence. We still talk about where you're placing different things. We're talking about when you define a sprite and then add sprite or blocks related to that sprite below it. So it's still there. It just is not necessarily the typical definition of syntax that you're thinking about when you go to text. But having that background, that foundational understanding in blocks just frees up that kind of cognitive load so that you do have more space to think about the syntax when you go back to text-based code. Alrighty, so one last example that we wanted to talk about when transitioning from blocks to text is how you can create custom sprite kinds in a project. And these are used to group sprites of the same type in a project. This is really useful. As you can see in the screenshot, MakeCode provides 4 different default sprite options, which are player, projectile, food, and enemy. Those are really useful if you want to create a new custom sprite kind. So let's say we want to create a goal sprite kind in our project. In the blocks editor, this is super easy to do. You can select that drop down and then just select add a new kind and then type in your new custom sprite kind name and then press OK, and it will automatically create that new sprite kind in your project. But when you go to the JavaScript editor, creating a sprite kind requires even more advanced syntax. Students need to access the sprite kind namespace and write a line of code to define the new kind. So again, when we're thinking about beginners, that can feel like a really big step to do something relatively simple and relatively common in a project. And so to support this transition, students can use the blocks editor to easily create their sprite kinds, their custom sprite kinds. And then once they've done that, they can toggle back to the JavaScript editor, notice how that code is written, again, looking for those similarities, those differences, how they can view the same exact code. It's doing the same exact function in blocks versus JavaScript to help them bridge their understanding as they build their confidence with text-based coding. And again, I know there was a comment again about putting these into maybe classroom posters. I feel like this would be a really great thing to have as a classroom poster. It's just a reminder of how you can create a custom sprite kind, because this is a super common thing that can happen in a project. And this text is a bit more advanced. Even for us, I feel like I always need to go back to an old project and see how we added this. But I think just having that toggle easily available just makes this transition much easier. So yeah, there are lots of little things you'll notice as you kind of introduce this to your students. There are lots of nuances between blocks and JavaScript. And it's okay. It's good that students are, discovering these things on their own, but anything that you can do to kind of support this transition, helping them notice the similarities and the differences between the code is great. Alrighty, Jonah.
Thanks. And to the person who asked about making them classroom posters, we did provide these slide decks to the MakeCode team, and I believe they are sharing them out. So you are welcome to grab any of this and print any of this or share this with your students. Please do, and then we would even love to know how you're using this, because this is such an important topic, and I think some people are sort of nervous to switch over to text because it is a little bit daunting, especially if you are new to coding. And as Sara said at the top of the presentation, both of us aren't, computer scientists and don't have that background. We are educators who got into coding through teaching kids to code. So it's really cool to explore these things and even explore them with your students. And we even know that there's some additional things we could add to this presentation about that transition from blocks to text, because there are just so many nuances to pick out. But yeah, we want to highlight some of the important ones, and we hope, this is useful for you and your students. And so to that end, we do have some reflection questions, and we would love to hear from you in the chat. We would love to know, how might you use how might you use MakeCode Arcade to help students make that transition from blocks to text? And we can actually ask both questions at the same time, and then we'll be good teachers and employ our wait time. What's one difference between coding in blocks versus coding in JavaScript in MakeCode Arcade that you noticed and/or you might wish to highlight with your students? So please share your thoughts in the chat. So Sara, I guess we don't have, we're unable to see the YouTube streaming chat or any of the other streaming chats, correct?
I think they are integrated based on the icon next to each user.
Got it. That makes sense.
What I figured out.
Cool. Also, it looks like the slide decks were just shared in the chat, so you're welcome to grab our slides too. Just at that aka.ms/arcadecon 2025 slide. So please do grab our slides. We would love to know. It would make Sara and I very happy to know that they were being printed and shared with students on classroom walls. I love the idea of quizzing students about the differences between blocks and text, and just, bringing that to the forefront and having, kids really aware of it and anticipating these things too, because it is daunting. You're like, wait, I used to just pick that from the drop down and now I have to remember it or type it in. Once students have transitioned to text, I can teach my students more advanced concepts like object-oriented programming. Absolutely. It's really powerful to see just how rich the JavaScript and Python. Again, we are only talking about JavaScript, but both editors are really strong in a really great way to get kids set up for success with other programming languages, other programming tools. When you get used to typing language, your thoughts can flow into the computer more quickly if you're a quick typer. Agreed. And even on our team, when we were writing curriculum starting in blocks, there were folks on our team who were just more used to typing code. And so it even works in reverse, where some of our teammates, as we were creating projects in MakeCode, would actually create it in JavaScript first and then flip it over to blocks as we were creating block-based curriculum. So yeah, it's great that it works both ways. The order of code is one difference for sure, Ren. That's a really important thing to highlight with students because it will surprise them. It continues to surprise us. Sometimes you're like, oh, where did that function go? Oh, it's up there, even though I thought it was over here. Because kids do get used to the layout of their coding space. It's the first time you've sat and listened to someone for so long. Time flies. Awesome. Yeah, it can be tough to take the training wheels off. Absolutely. But the switch to text doesn't have to be permanent. And yeah, we would even encourage pretty regularly switching back and forth between text and blocks. Even as I code projects for different things, sometimes I start in text, sometimes I start in blocks. Sometimes I like the visual layout of blocks, but then I'm like, oh no, I need those extra parameters or I need that function. And so I flip over to text and, type it out in JavaScript or add in some parameters there, flip it back, and, just navigate those gray blocks as Sarah showed earlier. On the flip side, the blocks make the project code a bit easier to grasp all at once. Very much so. I'm very much a visual person. I love the visual layout of seeing something in blocks, especially when they're color coded. The color coding in the JavaScript editor is great, but those blocks are just, it's very cool to see that visually. And yeah, it helps learners who benefit more visually and making it fun to see it in text or vice versa. Yeah, the visual aspect of both is like really powerful and an important thing to reinforce with your students.
Yeah.
Well,
I was just going to mention
yeah.
one thing before we moved on. I realized we didn't talk about this, but when you're thinking about transitioning from blocks to text too, one other great feature about MakeCode is that you can actually drag the code functions from the menu in JavaScript. So it's not like students necessarily need to type everything from scratch all at once. But MakeCode has a ton of built-in functions that are the same built-in functions in blocks. Some of them don't always appear or don't appear the same way in JavaScript. But you can just drag, a huge chunk of a function into the editor. And so they're only kind of tinkering with small pieces. So when you're thinking about the transition and you're wondering if maybe students are a strong enough typer, they actually maybe don't need to do a ton of typing right away because there is that ability to kind of drag out and then adjust as they need.
And that's especially helpful for those overlap events, for loops where there's a lot of syntax that kids have to worry about or kids have to make sure they include. So yeah, it's really great to drag those out. Sometimes I still drag out the for loop or I drag out the overlap event instead of trying to remember all the things I've got to type.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we want to thank you all for spending the time with us today. Yeah, we want to thank everyone for participating today. Please, yeah, let us know. I mean, it would be awesome to see this discussed
Yeah.
in the forum as well. I hope you find all these resources helpful and that your students are successful with making this transition. Thanks, everyone.
That's good. Thanks, everyone.